And I should say that before I begin, my name is Mairead Stewart, working at the Tamarack Institute, and I'm joined here with Daren Okafo, and we'll be joined in a minute by our wonderful guest speaker today. Turtle Island, or North America, has been home since time immemorial to the ancestors of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. We recognize that in this territory, Indigenous rights holders have endured historical oppression and continue to endure inequities that have largely resulted from the widespread failure of non-Indigenous treaty people to uphold their responsibilities. I'd encourage all of you to join us in the chat to share your names, a little bit about yourselves, and what lands you're coming from today. We also have an African ancestral acknowledgement. We'd like to acknowledge that those who came here as settlers, as migrants, either in this generation or in generations past, and those of us who came here involuntarily, particularly those brought to these lands as a result of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery. We pay tribute to those ancestors of African origin and descent. And without further ado, I will pass it to Daren.
Thanks a million, Mairead. Hi, folks. Thanks a million for joining us today. This is the second of two webinars. The first webinar, we interviewed Riel Miller, who is one of the founders of Futures Literacy and Futures Literacy Labs, The Approach. And today I'm really lucky to be joined by Liz Koblyk, who's been working and collaborating with the Tamarack for the last little while to try and explore and kind of entertain some questions around how foresight and futuring and futures approaches manifest into the community sector in the social economy or social entrepreneurship space. And I've been really lucky to have a few conversations over the last couple of months with Liz, just kind of exploring some of the questions we both have around what futuring in community looks like, what it could look like, and importantly for me, how do we adopt new tools in a way that centers the community sector? I think we have this kind of history of pulling in tools from the private sector and from academia, and often we just kind of build upon the work that's happened. But I think with Futuring, we had this remarkable opportunity to pull in a fairly new innovation, a fairly new set of tools and new thinking, but in a way that may present us an opportunity to lead from the community sector, so to drive it with values, community-centric ideas, collaboration, collective voice, those kinds of things. So that's I think that's what we're going to try and do today. We're going to have a bit of a chat. I'll present a bit of an intro and overview to futures and futuring, and then I'll introduce the futures literacy approach and futures literacy laboratories. Full transparency, these are reasonably new tools to me. While I've been thinking about futures and futuring for quite some time, Futures Literacy Labs is quite a mature and sophisticated approach with quite a lot of thinking, a lot of ideation behind it. And this is a journey for me. So part of my journey is to try and understand how best to have a conversation around these kinds of approaches with other folks that I'm more familiar with, so folks from the community sector. Before we go ahead, I have a question for you folks. Is there a question you have about community futures, futuring approaches, and how they kind of manifest or exist or may come into the community sector? I think there's probably a mix of folks in the room today that have various backgrounds and varying backgrounds with futuring, future studies, anticipation, and certainly the community sector and community work more broadly, whether it's community economic development or asset-based development or so on and so forth. But I'm genuinely curious if there's any questions that you have that you arrived with, maybe type them into the chat box, or maybe don't hit send right away. We'll have a look at several of those arriving together in a couple of minutes. So as I said, Daren Okafo, I'm the Consulting Director of Collective Leadership here at the Tamarack. I'm also a researcher at the Center for Socio-Digital Futures at the University of Bristol. And I'm joined today by Liz, who's the founder of Vital Futures. She's an award-winning foresight practitioner, an experienced facilitator and grant writer. She trained in foresight at Carleton University's Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, the Institute for the Future, and the Future School. And before launching Vital Futures to help organizations stress test their thinking about the future, she developed and oversaw leadership and development programs within the community sector and within academia in Canada and further afield. So delighted to have Liz, and Liz is going to take over about halfway through the session and give us a more practical or grounded look at how we would innovate and use some of the tools from from the Futuring Toolbox, which is one of the things that she's been doing with the larger staff body at Tamarack. And it's really started to prompt some really interesting conversations and dialogue around what we could possibly do with some of these tools. So our objectives today, we don't have too much time together. We've got like roughly about an hour together, although it's like 50 minutes now. But I think what we could try and come away with is a brief introduction to future studies, some of the core concepts. Obviously, it's a fairly biggish field of research. While it's new and growing, but it's fairly big and established. So we're not going to do a deep justice to it, but we could at least tickle and trouble some of the questions you might have, and maybe begin a dialogue or open the door to some thinking. We'll try and reach an understanding of what we mean by using the future. So often we hear this in future studies. How do we use the future to better prepare for the future? Or how do we bring the future more in line with the present so that we can make better sense of how to move towards something called the future or a set of futures? So maybe we can approach a bit of an understanding or at least open the dialogue around that. We'll introduce futures literacy and the larger body of work a little bit, and also futures literacy labs as a set of methods or at least a family of approaches for facilitating thinking about how to use anticipation in the future. Really excited about some of Liz's innovation. So we'll introduce the Futures Diamond and the broader concept of tool innovation as a core component or a core kind of pillar of how we approach futures from an innovative and imagination perspective. And hopefully, really, for me, we'll begin a discussion in the sector about how we might adopt this thinking. So I want to try and present this or position this as an opening of a conversation. If anybody wants to follow up or connect afterwards, please absolutely feel free. Send me an email or connect with Tamarack, and we'll find a way to connect together. So I think we have the beginnings of something quite interesting in the sector that could help us navigate around some of the more immediate and reactive approaches that we've been seeing and planning and thinking about the future in the last little while. Necessary and natural given the kind of the myriad of crises or the polycrisis in front of us. But I think that's one of those kind of diminishing returns. We can't actually envision a type of transformative future unless we implement some of the approaches and tools and thinking from future studies. So if you did have any questions, I would invite you to throw them in the chat box. We'll try and address one or two. I'm going to be reasonably tight on time just because I want to make sure we have lots of time for Liz. But if there's any questions that people have, so Ronan mentioned, how can we help people in the community sector get engaged in longer term future thinking and imagining instead of just focusing on the immediate circumstances? And this is, Ronan, I think this is one of the things that drives me intensely at the moment because of the crisis around funding, because of the crisis around political instability. I think we necessarily have moved our vision closer and closer to today, and it's become less about planning far into the future. And of course, that's really detrimental to our ability to think and envision a really transformative future for us, whether it's in our communities or whether it's more broadly as a society. So I think that's partly why I'm excited about Futures Literacy Labs and Futures Literacy more broadly. I think it's a potential opportunity for us in the sector to think differently and further afield, further over the horizon in more interesting and more potentially transformative ways. David, how do we persuade community that this might be an interesting approach? That's the $64,000 question, isn't it? For me, I think partially it's the spending time with it and understanding subtly, but crucially, why it differs from some of the other approaches we've used. We use future thinking all the time. Strategic planning is a core part of how we work in the sector. But again, that's become really brittle and pragmatic in the last few years. We've started to respond deeply to funder needs, which again is crucial. It's part of the pragmatism of doing our work. It's also part of building multi-partnered, multi-sectoral efforts to move ahead. But realistically, I think once I started to open the book on this, in particular, reading Riel's book, some of the more foundational pieces in future studies, Roberto Poli's work, John Urey's work, it becomes fairly obvious fairly quickly that one of the things that binds us into not transforming when we talk about transformative change all the time is this reality of mental models, the fact that we leverage their past to build patterns and frameworks so that we can begin to anticipate in generative ways some kind of sets of futures. And it's remarkably contradictory, but those mental models that we build end up kind of rooting us in the patterns that have gotten us here in the first place. And one of the real gifts of Futures Literacy Labs and innovation, the likes of which Liz is doing, is that it really frees us up and brings imagination, creativity, and a generative energy into that conversation. So that question, David, I think one of the things is that for me it becomes self-evident, but also it's a shift, it's a qualitative shift in how we look across the horizon. So not just a new tool, but a new type of tools, a new quality of tooling that we can use. And it really brings back the kind of the centeredness of imagination, creativity, collective thinking, collaboration, the things that we often champion in the sector, but we can never get to because we're too busy just doing the work. From Sylvie, what are some differences between these tools and foresight methods used by policy horizons in the federal public sector? Is a great question. I think they grow out of the same place, and I'm certainly no authority on this. But I think one of the things that happens when we use foresight repeatedly is that often it breaks down. It's often successful. It often gives us useful ways forward. But also, in my experience, having used foresight and backcasting, forecasting in strategic planning for the last 10 years or so, it can often be dramatically inaccurate and wrong. And that habit of mapping out trends and patterns from the past, again, kind of slowly binds us into these set of mental constructs, these mental models that have a tendency to play out the past. That's not to knock the entire field of foresight, that would be nonsensical. And I think a lot of this thinking, a lot of these tools comes out of foresight. But I have an example in my slides that might help illuminate that a little bit. And really quickly, what are some of the differences? I think, yeah, for now, I think we can kind of jump into the slides if that's okay. If anybody has any other questions, if you want to stick them in, certainly if you want to stick your contact information in too, I think we can kind of turn back at a certain point and reconnect, and maybe we can have a larger conversation as a sector. Yeah, but I think just given the time, I'll just light into the slide. So what is future studies? What do we mean by future studies? So really quickly, kind of moving through some of the more kind of fundamental or foundational kind of knowledge around this. It's an interdisciplinary approach to studying possible, plausible, preferable, and desirable futures. That isn't the only catch bag of futures, and we'll see a couple of different approaches to kind of elucidating or pulling apart what the future and futures can look like and how we can describe them in more interesting, sophisticated ways. But realistically, it comes from several areas, including foresight, as mentioned, but it tends to fall into the social science world. It's often used as a component in discussing and planning how people and systems may live and operate in the future. So I think, again, to Sylvie's point, foresight is often used, and in particular, the forecasting and backcasting approaches, which are kind of main staples of the foresight world. We use those in strategic planning increasingly so over the last 5 years, and I've been trying to use them a little bit over the last 10 years or so in work with communities in terms of strategic planning. So we often use future studies as a way of discussing and planning how we might operate in some kind of unknowable future. It includes predictive approaches. So one of the kind of core tenets of foresight is that it's got a capacity to predict to some extent, and within a certain frame of reference and a certain control context. I think it's particularly good at predicting some stuff. But the work that comes from Riel Miller and some of the other folks at UNESCO shifts that a little bit and kind of prompts us to have to offer more adaptive ways of looking at the future. And so both these ideas, predictive and adaptive, help shape how we research, design, facilitate approaches, and how we engage in planning. And importantly for me, it troubles our linear notions of the past and present, suggesting multiple ways of interacting with both. So we tend to kind of operate with the idea that there is a past that gave rise to the present, and that will, to some extent, provide a substrate from which the future can emerge. The reality is quite a bit more complex and a bit nuanced. I'm originally from 70s and 80s urban sprawl, Dublin, Ireland. My perspective on colonization and coloniality is tinged heavily by growing up in the British colonial experiment's beginning and end phase of coloniality. While the conversation around coloniality and decolonization is very sophisticated and moving at a decent speed in North America and Canada in particular, it's qualitatively different. So my past with coloniality is different from where I come from, and therefore the sets of frameworks and models that I build to interpret what coloniality means to me in a conversation ends up being quite a bit different than my colleagues who grew up here in Canada. So this idea that futures helps us trouble the past splits it into many pasts. The past for a Salvadoran is different than the past for a person from Bedford in England, different from a past to a past from someone from Angola. And so we have this reality that there's multiple pasts that coalesce into something that looks like a layered or overlapped present, but again can bifurcate and fragment into multiple futures, many types of futures. And so one of the great constructs I think that comes from future studies is this idea of the future cone, this idea that there are potentially many futures in front of us. And so if you look at the image here, for example, there's projected futures that, tomorrow is likely to be reasonably predictable, although, it can shift for sure. There are probable futures, so we're seeing things like, excuse me, AI is becoming particularly present in education, for example. So there's a good chance that in the next 6 months, AI will be at least a part of the conversation around education in North America. There are plausible futures related to that. So AI may become some kind of, pseudo teacher at a certain point, as nightmarish as that may seem to those of you who grew up with Terminator and the films like that. Or even just have a critical reading of technology in the education space. And then, of course, there are possible and preposterous futures. One of the problems, though, is that stand here as we get further into the future, these become really, really hard to predict. And so often, I think, I've heard it explained that it's in terms of using foresight, it's often like placing a bet on a horse race. So you learn a little bit about the horses in the race, who are the jockeys, what are their histories, and then I place a bet, and then it's done. That system has now closed off to me, and I have to just let the horse race unfold, and what will be will be. So there's the kind of reality that using this approach, I'm kind of locked into whatever the future may arrive. Um, can I, should I make one large bet? Should I make a number of smaller bets, or should I even look around for different ways to speculate about the possible future of my betting and gambling habits? I'm not sure, but we have a way to kind of trouble this a little bit. And just playing with the words last night, I was just thinking about this, like, who saw the pandemic on the horizon? Well, the World Health Organization, the WHO, saw the pandemic on the horizon. It's just that we don't spend all of our time reading World Health Organization digests or listening to the speculation of the future. So we operate in different types of futures. We operate within different types of future cones, and part of what we're trying to do is help those layer on top of each other so that we can build towards some kind of collective future. So when we try to make sense of our world, we investigate our past experiences. As we mentioned, we form these kind of mental models of what we can anticipate in the future. If I've made chocolate chip cookies with the same recipe for 10 years, there's a good chance that if I make it tomorrow with the same recipe, I'll have similar types of experiences with those chocolate chip cookies. If I use a different type of butter with a higher water content or with salt in it, it may go off the rails a little bit, but there's a way for me to anticipate that. And that's based on this formation of mental models, these patterns that I kind of pull from my past. Our institutions and our socioeconomic systems are pretty much the same. We kind of build upon expectations that are established in the past, and we kind of expect them to be, or maybe we don't even expect them. We just assume that they kind of operate from there and build into a set of futures. If we want to become freer to truly innovate novel ways forward, i.e. what we often call transformative change, perhaps we should at least attempt to reveal our prepackaged mental models. And again, one of the kind of gifts of Futures Literacy Labs is that one of the things it does is helps us kind of illuminate and reveal what are these mental models. Doesn't mean that they're wrong or maladaptive. It's just that we're more engaged as critical learners if we at least know and understand what they are. We anticipate what's coming next. It's often wrong or partially wrong, but it provides us something to get a hold of so we're not kind of wandering into the future. And this idea of anticipation is universal. Living beings do it all the time. Plants, animals, single cell creatures, that we all operate with this attempt to anticipate what's across the horizon, even though it's utterly unknowable. So we come from different pasts, but we build mental models based on those pasts. And that often is the thing that stops us from getting together in multi-partnered, multi-sectoral collaboration. So the classic kind of, it's not contrived, but the classic example is often from the climate justice field, where we have folks that work perhaps in industry or in resource extraction, but also folks who work in natural resource stewardship. And we have folks who are activists based on their love and connection with the natural world. That can often reach a point of kind of, it just becomes we become unable, I think to some extent, or unable to kind of move past the differences in our mental models, what we expect the future to be based on our past. Those mental models, however, aren't hard baked. We can change them, but more importantly, we can also build new shared types of models, which makes for a really interesting way of having those multi-sectoral, multi-partner conversations. And for me, one of the exciting maybe advantages of futures literacy labs, excuse me, is this potential idea that we can create collective shared ways of looking at the future that are a departure from our previous mental models. One of the kind of the icons, or one of the kind of cornerstones of futures thinking, is Sohail Inayatullah. Some fantastic work. If you're interested, go look around. But a little more sophisticated language here about types of futures again, and certainly kind of invite you to go dig around. A very deep place to go looking if you're interested in futures. Very beneficial. In particular, Inayatullah's work around causal layered analysis is particularly interesting. And one of the things that it offers is it just offers us the ability to do a couple of new things with how we work. So to some of the questions in the chat, it gives us new tools, i.e. foresight, for example, or futures literacy. It helps us approach capacity building in more generative ways. So we're thinking about moving forward and entertaining novel or unpredictable ways forward in terms of what we might build in our capacity in our organizations. And also gives us some impetus to think differently about what we are, what we might want to become. So again, that idea of transformative change being qualitatively different than a progressive linear type of change. We're trying to change the game a little bit rather than just the players. So we're going to have a quick look. We'll take about 5 minutes and walk through 5 or 7 minutes and walk through Futures Literacy Labs. And then I want to leave a bit of time for Liz just to show off the work she's been doing, in particular innovation around the tool, the Futures Diamond. This work grew out of some work at UNESCO over the last couple of years, last decade or so, I think. Although Riel Miller has a reasonably extensive background in economics and foresight and has been thinking about this stuff from what I've read and the little I've talked to Riel for a couple of decades. So it presents us a lens to see the present in ways that are useful for building resilience and adaptability for various futures. And I think, again, for me, one of the things that it brings to the table is this idea of shifting the kinds of capacities we start to build for bringing the future into the present and being more resilient about the kind of novel futures that arrive, but also building an adaptability for the utterly unknowable futures that may arrive. So we go back to the horse race example, or betting on a horse race. What if my mental model doesn't allow me to look to the left or the right? And there's also a poker game going on the side that I can like shift my, some of my betting money to. Or maybe many bets is better. Maybe if it's a horse race, maybe my experience with futures tells me that it's pretty dangerous to bet on one predicted future. So maybe if I kind of scatter my bets across the field and also spend a bit of time in at the poker game, I might have a better return on my investment. And again, for me, I think this is one of the things that futures literacy provides. It provides us a way of kind of taking off those mental models or taking off the blinders that they imply, and really starting to think differently about what tools bring us into a kind of negotiation with the unknowable futures. And for me, what pops out in the reading and in learning from Riel or alongside the other folks that are trying to make sense of this work is that imagination, creativity, adaptability, and resilience are centered in this work. It's very familiar work too, as an adult educator or as someone who's used to popular adult education in the community sector. It sings the same kind of thing. People come together, there are safe spaces, they create together. It's constructivist in its pedagogy, so we're building things, so I feel like I'm productive and making my way into the future. And so again, this idea of diversifying bets, some will fail inevitably. That's just the way the universe works, but some won't. And I can start to cobble together the pieces that come out of that and build a set of pillars I can lean on to be more resilient and adaptable to the future. So I've also been doing a trainer or starting a trainer program with Few on Futures in Germany. And I just like this. It's really simple. It's quite pithy, but it's also quite direct. Futures literacy is a key competence for the 21st century. It enables us to use the future for a variety of purposes by using a variety of methods, thereby unlocking new potential for action in the present. So again, it's different types of tools, different qualities of tools, But again, it lands so deeply in the community sector because it really centers this idea of creativity, diversity, making sure there's inclusivity for that diversity, making sure that multiple voices are heard and multiple modes of expression are championed. So artistic modes, just traditional kind of text and video, but also just exploring what's possible as groups of people come together and form this kind of collective intelligence. So there is an approach, and there's a futures literacy playbook that I'll put a link for in the chat that you can go and download. It's really, really well documented, and it's a nice kind of like layout of how this works. But there is a nice kind of pedagogical kind of flow that Few on Futures introduced, and it comes from the original work that Riel did, the book as well. But that's this idea of reveal, reframe, rethink, and then act. So first we have to become aware of our mental models. So we spend some time, if there's 4 pillars or 4 blocks in a full day workshop, for example, the first one will be this attempt to reveal what it is how we anticipate the future based on our past, based on our mental models. We then use that knowledge to kind of explore alternative futures, not necessarily the ones we predict or the ones that we desire. And we get a sense of how we use our mental models to think about the future. Again, kind of loosening our sense that we have to be prescribed a way into the future by our mental constructs. We then can kind of explore a new approach to the topic by considering how we went through step 1 and 2. So once we have a kind of a shine a light on our mental models, we can start to kind of work around the edges of it, work around the sides of it, and start to think, what would I do differently? What is not here? Is this overly pragmatic? Is it overly aspirational? Are there other ways I can think about the topic that I'm engaged in to really kind of shift my thinking qualitatively as opposed to just a different version of that thinking? And then for those in the community sector, I think will resonate deeply, and then we can act. We can start to build new shared models of resilience and adaptability together in the present. So we go back to the example of the climate adaptation collective or collaborative. If we get stuck on those clashing mental models, this kind of pedagogical flow gives us an opportunity to step outside them and realize that we're not bound to them, and therefore we can construct new ones together. We can literally construct new patterns for what the future is in different ways so that we're not bound to our our siloed ways of looking at the future. And for me, the potential in the community sector is not, I mean, you don't want to overstate it, but I think there's a significant potential here to really shift how we think about ways forward. And this is just a nice visual from Fuon's website. Again, this idea of reveal, reframe, rethink, act. It might be a useful place for you to go and dig around if you're interested, but they also do some wonderful work. And several of their consultants have written some nice, very approachable and very manageable pieces on futures literacy labs as an approach. Okay, so really quickly then from the futures literacy playbook, a couple of core kind of components of what these should or could or might look like. The labs are about learning. So transformative learning occurs when our knowledge about the world is challenged. Constructive approaches build on this when we create potential solutions together. So again, it's a qualitatively different way of thinking about the future. The labs are legitimate laboratories, so they're open and free to experimentation, imagination, and creativity and imagination are actually really crucial. And to build a little bit of momentum for what Liz is doing at Vital Futures, tinkering is really important to how we go forward with this, not using these tools prescriptively, but really pulling them apart and asking, are they doing the thing we need them to do? So tinkering, even with the tools, is kind of crucial. The labs deploy collective intelligence. This is just a huge bonus of this approach. They're co-designed around the topic and aim at creating safe, interactive, and open spaces for inclusive participation. And we're building new types of intelligence that we can deploy against the oncoming futures together in unique ways. And there are also encounters anticipation, and this is directly from the playbook. The future exists in the present as anticipation, as an expectation of what might be. So we bring the future into the present to think more generatively about how to move across the horizon with some degree of purpose, some degree of focus, but also with adaptability, resilience, creativity, and the ability to pivot and shift and change and absorb what may be coming unknowable, but may be useful as fuel for a really interesting way forward. So really quickly, like what does this look like in the community sector potentially? So multi-partnered, multi-sectoral collaboration and collective action depends on building trust and consensus at key points in the process. And so development of specific collective intelligence or context-specific collective intelligence is really interesting. True transformative change calls us to leverage unique, novel, and connected departure points in our thinking. And this also offers, or these approaches offer an interesting way there. Creativity and imagination can bring us into closer contact with other parts of ourselves and reveal more aspirational, less pragmatic approaches to envisioning transformation and change. For those of you who have worked in the community sector for a long time, the work can get very pragmatic very quickly. And we can just get to work and get the thing done because we're trying to lift the burden for those we work with in community. Sometimes that negates the more aspirational, more dreamy parts of our younger selves that really felt like we could lead or move toward transformative change. And I think these approaches really open that back up. And by our nature in the sector, we're engaged in bringing futures into being. Reflective practice is a part of what we do, strategic planning, new policy formation. These are all part of how we act anyway. So this is another set of tools and another way of thinking about the future. And so there's a couple other tools that will be really interesting to look at. Sahil and Unitella has also innovated the futures triangle, which is a really interesting way of looking at the tensions and pressures and pushes that we have to entertain when we're looking at innovating something around the future. A very sophisticated, very mature piece of work is the causal layered analysis approach from the same group, which is quite interesting. I really think there's a lot of potential for that in the sector too. Foresight, forecasting, backcasting has definitely been picking up speed, and I think it's been really useful, particularly backcasting and strategic planning has been fantastic. And we also use, some of the things I've been using for years, postcards and headlines from the future. What does future success look like? And we often bind that with backcasting. So if we talk about an aspirational future forward, what do we do then to move back from that future to get to now, and how can we kind of start to strategize ways into the future? And there's a couple like kind of pithy platitudes, but I think they're really useful here. The map is not the territory. We go back to this idea that tinkering, even with the tools, is a core component of how we work. Even though we have these mental maps, they're not directly applicable to the territory we're trying to navigate. They're simply heuristics we use to move forward. And one of the key strengths or one of the key opportunities and openings in this work is our capacity to innovate around the tools themselves. And I had some kind of questions that were kind of hanging around the use of the futures triangle for a while, specifically in the community sector. And last week, Liz presented some work she's been working on around kind of expanding that tool. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Liz in. I think Liz has a Miro board, so we're going to send around a couple of links, I think, in the chat perhaps. Although I'll hand it off to Liz now, and I'll be quiet and give the mic over to Liz because I'm really excited about. So, hi, Liz.
Okay, thanks. Hi, Daren. All right, I will start to share that Miro board. And yeah, thanks for inviting me to this. Just to clarify, Daren is very flattering. I do not consider myself an expert in foresight by any means, but one of the things I love about it is that it offers endless learning, and yet also I think a fairly easy on-ramp. So it can start to be useful right away. And hopefully we'll get into that a bit right now. As Daren already pointed out, it has a background in corporate use, and so it's been used to enhance profitability, to identify a lot of risks. And a question came up about its use through policy horizons. They are also very risk focused, which makes sense since they're doing foresight for and with the federal government. But it's also been used to expand, what we see in that cone of possibility that Daren showed us. So it's not about predicting one future, but about imagining a range of possible futures and working with those, whether that's to identify points of leverage that might help us be effective across multiple futures, whether it's getting us out of living out someone else's imagination of the future, whether it's being more effective in shepherding our own energy. There are all kinds of ways to use it. And I think it's really ripe for use in community settings, because one of its weaknesses in corporate settings is that the inputs are narrow, right? There are often a bunch of like people imagining those futures, and even a really good tool for imagination is limited if it's a limited group of people who are participating in it. because it has so much room for diverse voices and experiences, and it's best, it's strongest when there is that diversity of people participating in it. It can also feel a bit overwhelming when you start getting into foresight tools. And I certainly, in my own experience of facilitating it, sometimes people do feel like they might be opening things up almost too much initially, yet it does have a way of coming back to a focused point and helping folks see where they might be more effective. It does lead into strategic planning and, paring down to KPIs. But I think more useful than that, it's skill building. Once you start doing it, it is hard to stop. So, once you learn to scan for signals of the future, it's hard to stop doing that, but it's also easier to sort out noise from something that you ought to pay attention to. And it's also really good at getting out of sort of our own pre-made narratives of the future. I tend to be a pessimist, so I practice the apocalypse mentally all the time. And foresight is really good at getting me out of that. But it also prompts us to look for what's easeful. And when I used to be a career counselor, I saw all the time that, most people needed to have permission to act according to purpose. In community, people's sense of purpose and obligation to the greater good is almost a dampener on creativity, because when we feel anxiety, when we feel the need to get things right, that really shuts down the expansiveness that is, I think, required to be creative. I don't know anyone who has ever said that they forced themselves into really phenomenal levels of creativity. So foresight tools give us a chance to step out of those moments of pressure, to still be working for a purpose, but to look for the spots where we're not trying to shove the system uphill. We're finding the spots where a nudge can allow the system to do something different. So maybe just to give you a small example there, a food security organization that I worked with was planning on really trying to package a very large educational product for folks. And when we looked at a couple of different possible futures, very different from one another, they looked across those futures and said, you know what, this is actually going to be way easier, less work for us, and we're going to reach a broader group of people. If we look for these points of enlightened self-interest that are going to occur when people who aren't interested in our philosophy are just doing their best to put food on the table. So how can we help them do that in a way that's going to align with other values as well? So it can help find those more easeful ways in of accomplishing what we're trying to accomplish. I'm going to introduce two bits of jargon before we start tinkering a bit. So one, and I suspect a lot of people here already know these terms, but drivers of change or pushes of the present are these big forces that we talk about. So these are the shouts, right? Like the headlines, things where we know there's something that is creating change. So it's usually quantifiable. It can cause fear or at least a sense of being swept along. It's measurable. So things like climate change, inflation, the massive growth in AI. But those are not the only things that are shaping the future, right? There are also these signals of change, or weak signals, they're sometimes called, or pulls of the future. And these are like the little whispers, right? So something that exists, that is different, that would need to be nurtured in order to spread. It can be easy to miss, but it still has the potential to create change, even if that potential isn't often recognized unless you're looking for it. So probably the first people posting on social media did not know at the time that this was something that was going to alter what democracy looks like. Or it could be something that gets press, right? Like the first bleeding veggie burger. Or it could be a surprising development on something that already exists. So alternative community currencies have been around for a while, usually about local people investing locally. Recently, Pay in Copenhagen has been experimented with as a way to reward tourists for behaving like invested locals. So that's got, that's got potential to impact not only community currency, but also tourism. It might change the face of voluntourism and make it into something less nefarious. Like there are all kinds of possibilities there. Most of us, when we think about these signals of change, like we go to tech because that's what gets attention in the media. But it can also be, law, politics, policy. It could be social interactions, environment, how we do business, how we pay for things, how we spend our time in and out of work, how we think about and express ourselves culturally and spiritually. And it is really okay for these signals to seem frivolous. Memes are actually a great source of, I would say, signals of the future. Um, so I don't know if, let's see, I won't be able to see, I think, the chat, but does anyone want to suggest something that they think might be a signal of the future? And maybe Daren, you can let me know if someone's suggesting one.
Chat open here so I can let you know. Gregor, immigration.
Okay, I would say, immigration, AI, aging population. Okay, we're definitely getting at change here. Okay, we have both drivers and signals here. Yeah, so the big stuff, like immigration, AI, aging population, like all of those are absolutely drivers of change, and each of them with signals too associated with them. So while AI is a driver, I'd say a signal of change that relates to AI might be, Indigenous groups that are starting to use AI as a way of preserving Indigenous languages. Hearing more people talk about land trusts. Yeah, land trusts are, I would say that is a signal, a different way of doing things, different way of understanding land and stewardship and money. Small groups of neo-Luddite teenagers. Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Tariffs, definitely a signal of something bigger. Yeah, we've got, okay, lots of, what's TikTok trend? What's the particular TikTok trend, Nina, if you don't mind elaborating? Oh, I put Nina on the spot. Okay. Yeah, so definitely this is already a futures literate group. One thing that we could, normally do with these is start to populate a futures triangle. I'm not going to get into this too much, but this is a traditional futures triangle where we have one side that looks at those pushes of the present, those things that are sweeping us along, AI, climate change, demographic shifts. We'd also have a side of the triangle where we have those poles of the future, those things that we might nurture. And then we've got weights of the past. So this is the last term I'm going to introduce. And so these are simply things about the current state that make status quo the most convenient, the path of least resistance. So if we had this question, how can we make loneliness obsolete by 2040? Well, if in our community, we actually don't have gathering places where everyone feels comfortable, like that would be a way to the past. However, I don't love this tool for a specific reason, and that is that, like some foresight tools, it can give kind of a halo effect to things that are new, and also miss out on other things that can help with momentum, like gifts of the past. And I think this is especially true when it comes to cultural teachings, stories that we hold dear, models of interacting that might be either supplanted or simply ignored, like actually very healthy and ignored. So I'm going to suggest that we actually get our feet wet for even 5 minutes. Yeah, let's take 5 minutes to do this. I'm going to assume for the, just for this exercise, that we are all going to rally in some way around the question, how can we make daily play the norm for adults by 2035? Whether you're coming at this from, an evolutionary psychology perspective, and you say, well, if all mammals play, then it's probably worthwhile. Whether it's frustration with technology and you don't want to be entertained, you want to be creative, mental health, community building, whatever perspective. And one of the very cool things that hopefully we'll get to see ourselves right now is that what's obvious to you won't be obvious to others, and some of the things other folks come up with would never have been on your radar. But if let's see, if I go ahead and I'm going to briefly stop sharing so that I can grab the link. I'm going to put the link in our chat and invite folks to start populating this wherever you want to on the board. I'll start sharing again. Oops. Okay. So hopefully you should be able to just pop into the board, grab yourself a sticky note, put as many as you want on here, and pop. Yes, Molly, thank you for starting us off. I'm gonna be quiet for the next 5 minutes and just have folks add on wherever they like. Daren, that includes you if you want to dig in. Okay, awesome. This is a group that does not hesitate to dig in. Now, obviously, in the time we've got, we're not going to be able to take next steps with this. But you can probably even, I'll leave the board up so that people can continue to see it afterwards. And one of the things that's kind of cool to do with this is to start to identify trends that involve at least two of the sides of the diamond, because you can start to see where there might already be momentum that you can act on. And you can also start to see that there might be ways in which something that initially seems either entirely negative or entirely positive is not, that either has a shadow side or it has a way of being reframable, like something that can be used in an unexpected way. So for the last couple minutes, people can't even stop. I love it. It's a good sign. For the last couple of minutes, I will suggest ways to take this away and use it on your own. So these tools are for tinkering with. There are, and actually maybe to touch on a couple of the questions that I saw come up. There's some very cool folks who are doing things very different from this. And one is Ingrid Lafleur. She's based in the US, and one of the things I think she does really well is ask fascinating questions that can help snap people out of received ways of thinking. So she does these world-building events that are usually based on a very provocative question. My favorite was, what if our relationship with our government was romantic? If you don't want to leap straight into coming up with questions like that, a way in is to actually say, what do I believe will absolutely still be true about topic X in 10 years? And I'm taking that from Jane McGonigal's book, Imaginable. That is a really good way into figuring out where you might have fixed ideas, and then force yourself to go research how you are wrong, how that thing is already changing. Another person who uses arts-based and narrative-based approaches instead of a more corporate-esque tool is Pupil Bisht. She does really cool storyboarding work and has worked with youth. They both just do very cool stuff. But you can just tinker with what we've got here, right? Either the futures triangle or the futures diamond, and use it for a question that matters to you. right? Whether it's something that keeps you up at night, whether there's a disagreement in a community group that you're working with about how to move forward with something, or you're anticipating a change and you coming down the pipeline and you don't know how to deal with it yet. Build yourself a question as the central point of that tool and start populating it. Maybe share it with other people and start to explore how you could play with this. Like, how could you use foresight in your community group to create a sense of expansiveness where right now it feels like your options are far more limited than you would like. And it can also be really useful to use this to allow disagreement to exist, because a starting point for foresight is really not what do we agree should happen, but what do we agree is possible. And Daren has already mentioned causal layered analysis. That is a really good tool for allowing different perspectives to coexist, to force yourself into understanding them more, even when they're not palatable. And then getting to what those underlying assumptions are that are driving the work that maybe no stakeholders are really happy with. If you want to reach out to me, I've left my email address here, liz@vitalfutures.ca, and my website is vitalfutures.ca. And I will stop there and just say thanks for digging in.
Thanks a million, Liz. That was fantastic. Maybe just to very gingerly and gently contradict Liz's proclamation of not being a particularly expert at this, somehow managed to, in 20 minutes, bring us through some theory to a very engaging practical exercise, and then some learnings on the other side. So I don't know, in my world, that accounts for expertise. Unfortunately, we don't have any time for questions, but we did have a nice back and forth, I think, as best we could in the chat. My hugest thanks to everybody.
And thank you everyone for sharing your contact details. I hope you join us for more webinars in the future, and thank you for being here.